A billionaire is chatting about his failed marriage and therapy when suddenly a little boy runs in and exclaims, "Mom, stop." As he goes on about his complaints, the therapist, feeling a bit embarrassed, tries to quiet him down. But then, she suddenly stops, completely taken aback. Let's see what the billionaire has to say next. But first, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up to support the channel. Now, just sit back, relax, and enjoy. Carl Stevenson was sitting stiffly on the leather couch, one arm draped over the. It felt like he was back here by choice, not because his company's board was pushing him. Therapy seemed pointless. But he was here to keep investors happy, but a CEO dealing with a messy divorce wasn't exactly ideal. It's been quite a ride with the way the media has been all over his personal life, really tearing it apart and making Vanessa look like the villain. The poor neglected wife and him as the cold-hearted billionaire who had pushed her away. He just didn't care about there. He had his opinions, but what really mattered to him were the stock prices. That was his main focus. She sat there, feeling the weight of Dr. Amanda Bennett's unyielding stare, waiting for him to finally say something that mattered. Across from him, her notepad balanced on her knee, looking like the perfect picture of professionalism. She wasn't the first. The therapist the board had sent him to was different. She was the first one who didn't seem impressed or intimidated by him at all. It really got under his skin, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was just the way she always had. She offered a different perspective on his statements and made sure he couldn't avoid answering her questions. She was looking for answers and wanted him to really think about his part in the breakdown of their marriage. But he couldn't stand that. Vanessa had taken what she wanted and moved on, and so had he. So what was there to talk about? The silence lingered between them, and he realized she was just waiting for him to say something. Was annoyingly patient, never rushing him, but always keeping an eye out, always tuned into what he was doing. He let out a sharp breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced, as he finally opened up to her. "So, you're curious about why my marriage didn't work?" Well, he didn't really give her a chance to respond because it just wasn't meant to be. Marriage turned out to be more of a business arrangement that eventually lost its purpose for her. People reacted just like they usually did when he spoke so bluntly, no raised eyebrows, nothing. With a disapproving frown, she didn't rush to correct him. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "Considering him, and yet they were married for 6 years. He just shrugged, saying it was convenient. Amanda tapped her pen against the notepad, ready to respond, when suddenly the office door swung open. The sudden noise made him flinch before he could help it. But any irritation at the interruption was quickly taken over by confusion when a small curly-haired boy burst into the room, hands on his hips. There's that determined look on someone who's ready to make an announcement. "Mom, can you stop listening to him complain and just ask him out already?" Carl blinked, and Amanda froze. The kid, who had to be no more than 7, looked between them, waiting as if he had just figured out a problem they both had been dealing with for a while. Amanda shot up from her chair so quickly that she nearly knocked it over. She picked up her notepad and tried to guide the boy out of the room, but he just stood there, not budging an inch. Not bothered by the look of horror on his mother's face, Johnny said, "I'm serious." "So, he's got his arms folded, and you always mention how you like smart guys. Plus, he's rich. Which is a nice perk, right? And it seems like he could really use some help. Because, look at him." Carl is still processing and let out this incredulous laugh. Before he could stop himself, Johnny turned to him with a pointed nod. "Hey, you seem like you could use some more cookies. My mom makes the best ones, seriously. You'd really like them." Amanda managed to gently get a firm grip on his shoulders, but gently nudging him toward the door, saying that's enough matchmaking for one day. "Off you go." "Wait in my office," Johnny groaned. But he gave in, stopping for a moment in the doorway too. He tossed it over his shoulder, saying, "You should really think about it." The door clicked shut behind him, and the room went silent. Carl leaned back quietly, watching Amanda as she stood still, her fingers pressed too. She pressed her temple, almost as if she was trying to will herself to vanish. After a moment, he let out a deep breath. He slowly shook his head in disbelief. "Well, that's a first." Amanda turned. "I'm really sorry about that. He's usually not like this." "That's hard to believe," he smirked, stretching his legs out in front of him. "He's got confidence, and I respect that." She sighed, rubbing her forehead. I swear he must have overheard me chatting with a friend or something. He's never done this before. Shame, Carl mused. If he started charging for his services, he could probably make a fortune. Amanda shot him a warning look, as if to say, do not encourage him. Shrugged, still amused. I mean, he's got a point. You do listen to me complain a lot. She folded her arms, taking a moment to compose herself. It's literally my job, she said as he considered her. He paused for a moment, then casually tilted his head now that he's brought it up. It was like, what do you say, Dr. Bennett? Amanda blinked, totally caught off guard. What? You heard me. He stretched out, getting comfy. Once more, I'm watching her squirm just enough to be entertaining. Johnny seems to think we'd be a good match. Isn't that match completely inappropriate? He looked totally. Is he too pleased with himself now, or is it just fate? She let out an exasperated breath. So, if it's not fate, then what is it? Just a crazy situation that seems like it'll never change. It won't be forgotten, she said, picking up her notepad from where it had dropped on the floor in all the commotion. Carl wasn't backing down. You sure? Johnny seemed pretty convinced, and Amanda shot him a look. A glare that could have melted steel. The session is over, and he stood there smoothing out. That's a bummer about his jacket. I was really starting to like it. She opened the door. He was clearly ready to usher him out before he could say anything else, but he paused in the doorway. Glancing back with, catch you next week, Dr. Bennett. Unless, of course, you want to do something sooner. Take Johnny's advice and grab some dinner instead. Her expression said it all. Chuckled and walked out, leaving her standing in the doorway with an unreadable expression. She shook her head and she let out a quiet sigh, muttering to herself as she turned back to her office, where Johnny was sitting in her chair. Swinging his legs, he said with a grin, So, how'd it go? Amanda leveled her gaze. He shot him a look and said, You, young man, are grounded. Johnny didn't even glance up. Amanda closed the door behind Carl, pressing her back against it, feeling a mix of emotions. She was remotely sorry, but was it worth it? She paused for a moment, trying to gather herself, while Johnny sat there, comfortably in her chair, still swinging his legs as if he hadn't just barged into a session and turned her. Are you serious? She asked, rubbing her temples, her professional reputation feeling like a punchline. Johnny grinned, totally unrepentant. What? He said. He liked it. And you? Amanda let out a slow breath as she crossed the room to Neil, not exactly saying no. Hey, Johnny, just listen up for a second. I'm a pro, and Carl Stevenson is my. Being patient means I can't ask him under any circumstances. Out. Johnny thought about this for a moment, then tilted his head. So, if he wasn't, you could be a bit more patient, right? She sighed, getting up and gesturing towards the door. Go to your homework now. Johnny stood up. The chair was still smirking, and by the way, you're welcome. Amanda watched him leave. Then she collapsed into her chair, staring at the ceiling, while Carl Stevenson was already there. He's unbearable now that he has something to hold over her. She'll never hear the end of it from him. So, at the next session, Carl strolled in with 2 cups of hot chocolate. He set one on her desk before she could say anything, and then took his usual seat, stretching out comfortably, out in a way that made him seem totally in control of the room, and he watched her reaction a bit too closely. With a lot of amusement, she folded her arms and asked, What's this hot chocolate extra? Marshmallows for me, for Johnny. Amanda inhaled slowly through her nose, that is. Carl shrugged, totally inappropriate. I figured he's just an investor in our progress. She'd thank him for his contributions, but she wasn't sure what was worse, that he had done it to push her buttons or that Johnny would totally love it when she picked up the cup and set it down. Look, if you think I'm just going to forget about what happened last session, you're mistaken. I'm not going to ignore it. What part? Carl leaned forward and asked, What about the part where your son called me out? Hey, what happened to my question? I didn't get a response. Amanda tightened her grip on her pen, the part where my. Did the patient go too far? He smirked, and yet you still haven't fired me? He exhaled slowly and said, Carl, we're not doing this. Doing what? Whatever game you're playing. For just a moment, his gaze held something hard to decipher before he leaned back again. No games, Dr. Hey, Bennett. I'm here for my mandatory emotional evaluation. Remember, she chose. She decided not to engage, flipping open her notepad. Then, to her surprise, he actually joined in this time. And even though he still had a knack for deflecting with humor, it was different. He seemed to be more intentional with his answers, opening up about things he hadn't shared before, like the issues in his marriage. He had never built on real affection, spending years prioritizing work over his wife, and he hadn't even realized it. I noticed when things started to fall apart. What did she say when she left? Amanda asked, keeping her voice neutral. Carl exhaled, rubbing his jaw. She said, Amanda looked at him closely, thinking, I never really felt like I knew how to love someone, even if I wanted to. Do you think she was right? Something flickered in his expression, but he masked it quickly. I think she deserved it. There was someone who could show her she was wrong, but it wasn't me. She wasn't quite sure if that was a genuine thing. It was either an answer or just a way to avoid the truth, but honestly, he had only just begun to scratch the surface of it all, beginning to show her the real Carl Stevenson, the untouchable billionaire behind the polished facade. She didn't want to say it out loud, but she actually found that side of him pretty interesting. But that didn't mean she was going to put up with his endless teasing. Unfortunately, Johnny didn't get that. It all began with some small boundaries. Amanda had a feeling that he was eyeing matchmaking the moment he saw Carl come in. He had hot chocolate, but he was clever about it, taking his time to enjoy it first. Hey, have you noticed how Carl makes those casual comments at home? He's kind of funny, right? Or sometimes he just throws out these totally unsubtle suggestions like, you should probably. I'm thinking about getting back into dating. Maybe someone who's tall, has dark hair, and runs a business empire. So, one morning, Johnny said he had sprained his ankle in the kitchen, and that's when the more direct attempts started. Amanda, worried, I bent down to take a look. Just as Johnny dramatically flopped onto the floor, groaning in an over-the-top way. Mom, I'm in so much pain I can't walk. Can you call Carl to carry me? I mean, to help me out? She gave him a long look, and he peeked one eye open too. She playfully flicked him on the arm and said, go to school. That weekend, he made plans. The whole candlelit setup at dinner in their living room, featuring a lovely tablecloth, a playlist of soft jazz, and an audience of. He had already set 2 places with stuffed animals when Amanda walked in and froze. No way, Johnny was just sitting at the table, resting his chin on his hands. Come on. It's good practice for when Carl finally asks you out. She grabbed the plates were stacking up, and you just can't help yourself, can you? Johnny groaned, dropping his forehead onto the table. She just tossed it onto the table without even trying to make my job easier. Then she pinched the bridge of her nose. Johnny, you don't have a job, and she keeps saying that. His persistence should have been enough. It's been pretty annoying, but honestly, it's mostly just ridiculous. If it had only been him, I could have easily brushed it off, but Carl was having a blast, totally playing it cool and acting like he had no idea what Johnny had set up. So, there were 3 separate accidental run-ins. The first one happened at Amanda's favorite coffee spot. She was at the shop where Johnny had dragged her one Saturday morning, and she was in utter shock when Carl strolled in just minutes later. Later, I thought, wow, what are the chances? Johnny said way too loud, and Carl raised an eyebrow. It's almost like someone had it all figured out, Johnny gasped. Do you really think that would be so? Is that wild? Amanda, still half asleep, pointed at him and said, sit down. Meanwhile, Carl got Johnny a pastry. Amanda promised to ground him for a month the moment they were at the grocery store. Johnny totally spaced on which aisle Amanda told him to go to and instead came back with Carl and the toe looking all smug. And the third one, the worst of the bunch, was when Johnny asked Carl to come to a school event, but he didn't mention that Amanda was there, thinking it would just be a regular parent-teacher thing. She arrived in the evening, only to see Carl standing next to Johnny, holding a program she had marched in. She leaned in closer to her son, lowering her voice. Johnny, what's going on? Johnny just grinned. He rocked back on his heels and said, I told Carl you were coming. Then he added that he had nothing better to do, she said as she turned to Carl. You actually came. He smirked. What can I say? I didn't have anything else going on, and she was really wanting to strangle both of them. Carl, of course, found it all amusing. This is all so entertaining, but the worst part. Amanda. Amanda was beginning to enjoy it, even though she tried to ignore how much Carl had woven himself into her life. She kept telling herself that it was all Johnny's fault. If her son wasn't so set on playing matchmaker, Carl wouldn't be in the picture, hanging around the outskirts of her everyday life. But the thing was, Carl didn't seem to care. If anything, she felt encouraged every time she thought she had set a clear boundary, but he always found a way around it. It's like dancing right on the edge, enjoying her frustration. Just pushing enough to get a reaction but never going too far. He leaned back in his chair, feeling like he was ready to cross the line outright at the next session. He looks way too comfortable. That usual smirk on his face. At this point, It seems like Johnny has become my unofficial life coach, and Amanda just sighed, clearly exasperated. You're not really supposed to be chatting with my 7-year-old like he's your business consultant. But hey, he's got some good ideas. Carl shrugged, stretching his arms out like he had all the time in the world. Honestly, he's done a better job of getting me to think about my personal life than you have, she said with a hint of sarcasm. Are you really saying I should let a second grader handle your therapy sessions? He thought for a moment that it might be worth a try, but she just shook her head and flipped it open. She passed him her notepad, and he was right. He had been opening up more, even though she wasn't. I'm not sure if it was Johnny's interference or if Carl was just finally ready to let his guard down that day. He caught her off guard by shifting the chat to something genuine, something open. You keep pressing. Tell me about Vanessa, he said, his tone a bit more reflective than usual. But the truth is, I don't think it was really about her. I just never figured out how to be a husband, Amanda paused, observing him closely. My parents were never really the best role models, she said. He hardly ever brought up his past during their sessions. He always kept the conversation centered on his failed marriage. His public image focused more on the logistics of his personal life instead of the emotional weight, but this time it felt different. It wasn't about Vanessa at all. She kept her voice neutral. What were they like, Carl? Letting out a slow breath, I tapped my fingers against the armrest. They weren't cruel or anything, just a bit detached, business first. Emotions came second. If they even mattered at all. My father ran his company like a kingdom, and my mother. I thought I was supposed to fit into that world. But I figured out pretty quickly that being vulnerable didn't really help. It just didn't get you anywhere. It really just made you easier to manipulate. Amanda studied him for a long moment. He wasn't looking at her anymore, and his expression was hard to read. But there was definitely something tense in the way he held himself. It was like he had conditioned himself to discuss these topics in a way that felt almost detached, as if he was sharing them without really connecting to the emotions behind them. Wanted to dig a little deeper, but she understood it was best not to push too hard. So she nodded slightly, keeping her voice steady. That's a lot to unlearn, he glanced at. He had something flicker across his face for a moment, but then it was gone. Yeah, it turns out some people really don't want to hang around for that. Amanda wasn't quite sure if he was talking about Vanessa or himself. Maybe it was both, who knows. Either way, it stayed with her long after their session ended. But she couldn't really linger on it for too long since Johnny. She was definitely on a mission. And she really should have known better than to have a phone conversation about Carl within. Just within earshot of her son, she had just wrapped up a conversation with her friend on the phone, sharing that she had declined a dinner invitation. Johnny, who had been quietly coloring at the table, suddenly perked up and said, "You said no?" He asked. Amanda sighed, horrified, as she lowered her phone. "You were eavesdropping," she said to Johnny. She brushed off the comment, saying, "Why would you say no? I worked hard for that." She crossed her. "Hey, you can't take credit for my love life when you never even go on dates. That's not really your concern, especially if you're doing things poorly." Choices. Amanda rubbed her temples. "Go do something productive," Johnny huffed. But Amanda didn't argue, which should have been her first clue that something was on the horizon. A few days later, she found herself at a charity event. Gala, definitely not her usual scene, but she had said yes this time for the clinic's sake. She had expected it. It was an evening filled with polite conversation, networking, and a bit of small talk, just what she had in mind. I definitely didn't expect to walk into the ballroom and see Carl Stevenson hanging out by the bar, looking sharp in his perfectly tailored outfit. He was in a tailored tuxedo, looking like he had just walked out of a magazine spread. "Froze. Johnny," she said, standing next to her with a triumphant grin. "You're welcome." Amanda turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What did you do?" He rocked back on his. "I might have casually mentioned to Carl that you were coming tonight and that you looked really nice." Before she could say anything, Carl had already noticed them in navy blue. He strolled over with his hands in his pockets, looking completely at ease. "Well, Well, fancy that. Seeing you here, Amanda forced a tight smile. I guess this is just a coincidence, huh? Hey, Carl seemed way too entertained. Just so you know, Johnny's really looking forward to it. They quickly grabbed a glass of punch from the table and turned back to Amanda with a gleam in their eye. In his eyes, she felt her stomach drop. Hey, Mom, she thought. But it was too late before she could say anything. Reacting quickly, the punch slashed forward, splattering against her dress in a messy burst of sticky red liquid. Johnny gasped at the sight. Oh no. False innocence. What a tragedy. If only someone had a... Amanda closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was a jacket you could wear. Carl was already shrugging off his tuxedo jacket, clearly enjoying this way too much. Here, he said, draping. It draped over her shoulders. Wouldn't want you catching a cold. Amanda clenched her jaw, but she didn't argue about how warm the jacket was. The weight of it around her shoulders sent a strange shiver down her. She noticed the way Carl looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes before he quickly masked it. She had that signature smirk, but just as she was about to say something, before she could even wrap her head around what was going on, a voice came from behind her. Amanda felt her entire body stiffen as she turned slowly. The familiarity of the voice sank into her bones as Daniel, her ex-husband, stood a few feet away. He was dressed in a suit, his expression caught between surprise and something sharper. His gaze flickered. Amanda and Carl were sharing a moment, both of them close together as Carl took in the jacket. I had no clue who Daniel was. I just raised an eyebrow. Is he a friend of yours? Amanda? He let out a breath, already sensing the headache creeping in. Johnny, still positioned between them, leaned in closer to Carl and whispered. That's my dad, he said loudly. This is going to be awkward. Daniel's gaze flickered. Amanda and Carl shared a moment, his gaze lingering on the jacket draped over her shoulders, making his intentions clear. He wasn't surprised to see her at an event like this. Charity work had always been her thing. But Carl? That was new. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit with practiced ease. The same effortless charm that had once drawn Amanda in, and now, with a hint of smugness, he said, tilting his. She tilted her head slightly and said, I wasn't expecting to see you here. And definitely not like this. Amanda took a slow breath, bracing herself. I could say the same. I'm in. I've been in town for a few weeks, so I thought I'd drop by. He turned his focus back to Carl, his eyes sharp with interest, and you are. Before Amanda could jump in, Carl reached out his hand, his face giving nothing away. Carl Stevenson, he said to Daniel. He didn't shake it off right away. Instead, he let the name sink in, and recognition lit up his face. Across his face, right, the billionaire. There was a short pause. The one who doesn't believe in love. Carl's fingers twitched a bit before he pulled his hand back, casually slipping it into his pocket. The smile didn't really reach his eyes. That's what the tablets say. But you know how. They can be pretty unreliable, Daniel chuckled, crossing his arms. Sure, but from what Amanda heard, they weren't wrong about the divorce. She could feel Carl tense up next to her, but he didn't take the bait. She stepped forward before this turned into a silent battle of egos. We should go, she said. Keeping her. Even Daniel lifted his hands and playfully mocked surrender, saying, Of course, wouldn't I? I want to interrupt whatever this is. Oh, it's nothing, she replied quickly. Too quickly. Carl let out a sharp exhale through his nose, his expression. He flickered for just a moment before slipping back into that carefully composed mask. Taking a step back, he adjusted his. Hey. Nice to meet you, Daniel. Without saying anything else, She turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd like nothing had ever happened. Amanda felt her stomach twist, but she pushed it down. Daniel smirked. It didn't seem like nothing. Amanda leveled her gaze. She shot him a look that said, I don't have time for this. Then she spotted Johnny waiting nearby. The dessert table seemed way too smug about itself, especially after everything that had just happened. It watched her with a hint of suspicion. Where's Carl? He asked, frowning at Johnny. Is it because of Dad? Amanda sighed. Complicated. Johnny crossed his arms. No, it's not. You like him, Johnny. I see that. The way you behave around him, and the way he gazes at you when you're not even aware of it. Don't even try to convince me otherwise. Nothing back there. Amanda rubbed her forehead. Feeling exhaustion settled deep in her. Bones Carl is my patient. Johnny groaned. So what? He's a person too. She actually listens to you. She pinched the bridge of her nose and said, "We're not having this. So, why aren't we having a conversation right now? It's just not that simple, you know?" Johnny was staring at. She looked at her for a long moment. Then in a much softer voice said, "Maybe it was before. But he's really giving it a shot, isn't he?" She paused, letting the words sink in. That night, after putting Johnny to bed, she felt an uncomfortable sensation in her chest. She was sitting at the kitchen table, just staring off into space, still going over the look on Carl's face when she had brushed off their relationship as insignificant. She had seen him deflect and noticed how he used humor to keep people at bay. It was a distance away. But this was the first time she had spotted something different, something that really resembled. She felt a wave of frustration, and if she was being real with herself, she didn't like how it made her feel. She was still feeling lost in it all. She thought about it for a moment when her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing it was Carl Stevenson asking about coffee. No therapy talk, no patient-doctor rules, just coffee. She stared at the message. For longer than she should have, Bennett asked, "Why, Stevenson?" "Because I want to," I replied. "I think you might feel the same way, even if you don't want to say it." Her fingers were just hovering over the keyboard. "Bennett, I can't." There was a. After a long pause, Stevenson either won't or can't respond. Amanda let out a breath and typed back. Before she could overthink it, "Bennett." She put the phone down and started running. She covered her face, but just then, Johnny popped his head into the room, clearly having caught the whole thing. He glanced over her shoulder, not saying a word, just giving her a really slow. "Really?" She gave a slow nod, almost like she was saying that she just made the worst choice ever. So the next day, she caught herself just staring at her phone again, going back and forth in her mind. She was thinking about whether to say something, but before she could, a new message popped up. "Hey Steph Benson, I'll be at Lincoln's Cafe at 6:00 if you decide to join." She really shouldn't have even thought about it, but there she was at 5:45, standing right in front of her. She felt a bit annoyed with herself for putting in effort at 5:55 while she was driving. She kept telling herself that she was just going to check if he really showed up at 6:03. As she walked into the cafe, her stomach knotted up when she saw him in the corner, sipping on a cup of black coffee. Coffee. She could still leave, or she could sit down. Carl glanced up at her. His eyes flickered with something hard to read as he pointed to the empty space. Amanda exhaled slowly as she sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The air between them felt different this time, like there was something unspoken stretching between them. Something neither of them could quite put into words. "Hey, just wanted to say that Carl finally spoke up. Took him long enough, right?" "Enough." Amanda shook her head, trying to hold back a small smile. "Don't push your luck," Carl leaned back, smirking. Wouldn't dream of it, but she knew better, and to her, surprisingly, she didn't mind that Amanda hadn't planned on staying. For a long time, she had convinced herself that this was just about satisfying her curiosity to prove that whatever was going on between her and Carl was just playful banter and a little interference from a 7-year-old. But about 20 minutes in, she started to see just how off her initial thoughts were. The conversation had kicked off on a light note. They chatted about the cafe, mentioning how Amanda had been a regular since her college days and how Carl only ever ordered black coffee. She reached for her coffee, saying anything else felt like a distraction. She called him ridiculous for thinking that way, and he just smirked and replied to her. She really thrived on efficiency. It was surprisingly easy and effortless, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Somewhere between the first and second cup, the conversation took a turn. Carl ran his hand along the rim of his cup. Her usual confidence faded into something more subdued. "I never really understood the point of Christmas when I was growing up." Amanda blinked. He was caught off guard, shaking his head. "My parents weren't the." Christmas felt more like just another business quarter, another obligation we had to get through. I've had parties, sure, but they weren't really about family. They were more about making connections, investments, and keeping up appearances. I don't think I ever really experienced Christmas until I was old enough to move out. Amanda tried to imagine what that childhood was like. It just feels empty without those twinkling lights, the cozy smell of cookies baking in the kitchen, and the excitement of picking out presents that really mean something. She had grown up with homemade gifts and her mom's slightly off-key caroling, filled with early morning excitement. With wrapping paper scattered all around, it was tough to picture anything else, right? Did you do it? She asked. He shrugged. Worked. That's what I do best. She watched him. He said it carefully, almost as if it didn't matter, like it had never mattered. But there was something in the way he said it that caught my attention. The way he looked away from her made her think it really did. Amanda paused for a moment before saying anything to Johnny. He absolutely loves Christmas. He starts counting down in October and even makes a list, but not 4. Gifts for fun nights with hot chocolate, decorating the tree, and watching movies. Marathons? It's Carl's favorite time of year. His lips twitched at the thought. Sounds exhausting, though. She smiled. It's a lot, but it's nice. Something flickered in his expression. Something she couldn't quite place. And you? She frowned. What about me? What does Christmas mean to you? The question took her by surprise. No one had ever asked her that before, and she could. I've mentioned before. It was really about Johnny and making things special for him, about keeping those traditions alive. But as she sat there, watching the steam curl up from her cup, and suddenly, she found herself saying something that used to mean something different. She admitted that safety was on her mind, her fingers tightening slightly around the mug as I was talking. When we were married, that was the only time Daniel really put in any effort. The rest of the year felt pretty strained, but Christmas was different. He showed up, he smiled, he played the part. And for a while, I let myself believe that meant something. Carl was quiet for a moment, then he said, that. It sounds lonely. She let out a slow breath. For the first time since she met him. There was no teasing, no amusement, nothing. Those smirks were placed just right, and the silence that followed spoke volumes. The moment hung there between them, neither wanting to be the one to break it, until finally, Carl leaned back and he cleared his throat and said, So, Johnny's school is doing a fundraiser, right? Amanda blinked. At the sudden change in topic, she raised an eyebrow and said, Yeah, why? I'll help you. He let out a sigh, already wishing he hadn't made that choice. Yeah, that's me. But if anyone inquires, I'm just hanging out here. She couldn't help but let out a laugh before she even realized it. And then she shook her head. She shook her head, thinking this was a terrible idea, while he picked up his coffee. But I'm still going for it. She really should have said no. She should have reminded him. They really shouldn't be doing things like this. They weren't friends. He was her patient, and that's how it was. It probably wasn't the best idea, but somehow she found herself nodding. And that's how Carl came into the picture. Stevenson found himself at a school fundraiser, right in the middle of a gym packed with parents all around. He stood by tables filled with baked goods and handmade crafts, looking totally out of place. But to his credit, he didn't seem to mind. Johnny was totally thrilled. You have to work the game booth, he said. Amanda practically dragged Carl across the gym, insisting, It's the most important job. Carl shot her a look that said it all. Your son. She's really pushy. She smiled. And he definitely gets that from his mom. Johnny took him over to a table. There were these small baskets filled with bean bags, and the idea was to toss them into a line of buckets, each one different from the others. Carl stared at the point values. This is the most important thing. Johnny nodded seriously about the job, while Amanda watched Carl, the same guy who he once said he didn't have time for distractions, but then he spent the next hour coaching kids on how to throw bean bags. He was surprisingly good at it, tossing things into plastic buckets and even keeping score, with the seriousness of a stock market analyst, but adding just the right amount of flair to get the kids giggling. And I even made a joke about putting money into better bucket technology at one point. Amanda strolled by right when a little girl gave him a high five. If anyone asks, Carl said, catching her expression, I'm still just here for the snacks. She rolled her eyes, but a smile was creeping onto her face. It was one of those moments where everything felt like it was changing, and then suddenly, his phone rang. Amanda. I saw it happen right in front of me. The moment he looked at the screen, you could tell something shifted. The relaxed vibe in his posture disappeared, and his face tensed up as he read the message that had just come in. He muttered something under his breath. And stepped away from the table, answering the call in a low voice. Johnny frowned as he glanced over. Amanda already had a sense of what was going on when Carl came back a minute later. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, he said, I have to go. Amanda nodded, trying to just brush off that little feeling of disappointment, right? But, Johnny. Well, you get it. Carl glanced at him, a flicker of something in his expression. But he seemed less understanding now. So, we schooled it back into indifference, right? Yeah, kid. Now Johnny's got his arms crossed, but Carl let out a sigh and said, "You'll have to win without me." Those words weren't really meant to be taken seriously. Amanda couldn't help but notice as Carl turned and walked away, leaving her to wonder what it all meant. As he made his way toward the exit, his phone was already in hand, slipping effortlessly back into the life he had built for himself, the life where work took priority, where feelings were an afterthought, where everything else was just. There was this noise, and just like that, the moment slipped away. 3 days went by, and then Amanda mentioned it. She wasn't waiting for a message. Carl had made his choice. He had walked away. Just walked away from that school fundraiser without even thinking twice, picking up a call that seemed to be more important than anything else. In that moment, she reminded herself that this was exactly why she had been hesitant in the first place. It wasn't personal. It never was with him. But that didn't stop her from. She found herself checking her phone more often than she'd like to admit, even though she knew Carl wasn't really the type to reach out. He tried to explain himself, but there was a part of her, one she didn't want to admit, that wondered if maybe this time would be different. It might be different. Maybe he'd just send a quick message saying he's busy and will explain later, or something like that. "Hey, I just wanted to say sorry for leaving like that. But honestly, there was nothing I could do." By the 4th day, she had managed to push it out of her mind. She had work to do and Johnny to think about. She really shouldn't have been thinking about a guy who had already shown where his priorities were. It wasn't until that. It was evening, and while she was busy making dinner, Johnny was sitting at the kitchen table doodling on a napkin when her phone rang. I barely glanced at the screen before answering, expecting a call from a patient. Instead, a woman's voice filled the line. "Dr. Bennett." Amanda frowned, recognizing the line but struggling to remember where it was from. "Sure thing, it's Naomi Carl Stevenson's." Hearing the name hit her like a slap, and the slight edge in the woman's tone really stood out. She was immediately on alert. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. "He's been in it." In the midst of the accident, everything else in the room just faded away. Naomi quickly explained the details. Carl had fallen asleep at the wheel. After working almost 36 hours straight, his car had veered off the road. He wasn't in any serious danger, but he ended up in the hospital, unconscious from a mild concussion and dealing with a broken arm. Amanda could barely recall how she responded, but she had a few other injuries that would take weeks to heal completely. As Naomi was still talking, Johnny quickly grabbed her coat. Noticing the expression on her face, he stood up right away, wondering what was going on. She paused for just a moment, then figured there was no reason to hiding it. "Carl's in the hospital." Johnny's face paled. "Is he okay?" "He will be," she said, though the words felt a bit weak. "Come." They drove in silence, Amanda's hands gripping the wheel tightly, her breath steady. Her mind was racing, and it just didn't make sense, this reaction, this deep twisting feeling. That feeling in her stomach? Carl wasn't something she needed to stress over. He was just a patient. Just a guy Johnny had grown fond of. Just a man who strolled into her life and turned things upside down. Then they should have been, but when she walked into that hospital room and saw him there, looking away too, everything else just faded away, and there was Naomi, arms crossed. She was speaking with a doctor, holding on tightly to her emotions. But then she turned when she saw Amanda and Johnny. They mentioned that he should wake up soon. So, the concussion isn't too bad, but he definitely needs some rest. Amanda barely caught what she said. She walked over to the side of the bed, her eyes scanning the floor, taking in the cast on his arm and the faint bruising along his skin. He looked different in the temple, more vulnerable. Like the man beneath it all. Sharp edges were finally out in the open, and there was Johnny, still hanging out in the doorway. She spoke up in a small voice. "It's because of work, isn't it?" Naomi nodded tiredly. "He hasn't slept well in days. I tried to get him to head home, but you know how he is." Amanda didn't know, and for the first time, she really hated it. She sat in the chair beside the bed, inhaling deeply to steady herself. It didn't matter how. She felt frustrated with him. He was here. He was breathing. And that was what really mattered. And then just as she was about to tell Johnny to sit down, Carl shifted, and it started off subtle, just a twitch of his fingers and a slight frown. But then his eyelids began to flutter, and a low groan escaped him. He escaped her gaze, his head turning slightly in her direction, and then his eyes sharpened, hazy yet aware. Amanda let out a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding Carl. He blinked, still groggy. "Did you rush here? Is it because you secretly like me?" Johnny snorted from the doorway, Amanda on the. On the other hand, she narrowed her eyes and squeezed his uninjured arm tightly, as if to say, "You almost died, you know?" "Read the room," Carl said, exhaling with a slight smirk. "I didn't almost die just, eh?" Amanda felt like shaking him after that little car crash, but instead, she just let out a slow breath. She rested her hands in her lap, trying to stay calm. "You're such an idiot," she said probably. His gaze flicked past her and landed on Johnny, who had moved in closer. "Hey, kid." Johnny crossed his arms, looking unimpressed. "I liked you better before. You really crashed your car, huh?" Carl chuckled a bit, wincing. "Sure." Johnny paused for a moment, then stepped up onto the edge of. He took a careful look at Carl for a while, and then said, So, does this mean we're going to be spending Christmas together?" Carl, still a bit dazed. "Let his. I'll tilt my head a bit toward Amanda if it means I can skip out on work." "Sure thing, kiddo Amanda." She shook her head. "You need rest, not company." Carl hummed, sounding like he wasn't convinced, but he held her gaze a bit longer, noticing something softer beneath her usual amusement. She really didn't like how it made her feel, pressing against something inside her that she had worked so hard to keep closed for years. Johnny, apparently satisfied, gave a firm nod. "Okay, but you owe me hot chocolate?" Carl sighed dramatically. "Fine, but only if there's extra marshmallows." Johnny gave him a thumbs up, and Amanda watched the two of them. There was this warm feeling in her chest, even though she really knew better than to get too attached to anyone who weren't supposed to stick around. But as she sat there, she couldn't help but watch Johnny lean against Carl like it was the most natural thing in the world. She wondered if, just maybe, this time was different. Carl was sent home with clear orders to take it easy, but Amanda wasn't so sure he'd actually follow them. The guy just couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes. Except when he was in a boardroom, where he could keep everyone engaged. He had grumbled through the process of getting dressed, feeling a bit nervous about it all. He was okay to drive himself home, even though his arm was in a cast and he was still moving a bit slowly from the painkillers. He rolled his eyes when someone suggested he needed a check-in. Amanda stood there with her arms crossed. She saw him dig his heels in and made the decision before she even realized it. "You're coming with me." Carl blinked. "What?" "Johnny's already expecting you. Christmas is coming, and I just don't think you'll actually take a break if I send you home by yourself," she said with a raised eyebrow. "Unless he'd rather spend Christmas Eve in your penthouse." Just staring at his inbox. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Amanda smirked, thinking that was how Carl Stevenson, the billionaire, rolled. He found himself in Amanda Bennett's living room, wearing a sweater that was way too big, one that Johnny had insisted he borrow, and feeling a bit out of place. Johnny was absolutely thrilled, bouncing around with more energy than anyone should have, directing Carl like a, "Hey, Tiny Foreman. Now that we've finished decorating the tree, it's your turn to put the star on top, Johnny," she declared, shoving the glitter-covered decoration into Carl's free hand. "It's tradition." Carl eyed the tree, not sure if. "Hey, you've seen it, kid, but I've only got one arm that's working," Amanda said from her spot on the couch. She sipped her hot chocolate and said, "Don't worry, Johnny. I'm sure Carl will figure it out." Carl shot her a look, but Johnny nodded wisely. "Yeah. You're a CEO, you know. Solve problems." "Unbelievable," Carl muttered, but he knelt down anyway. Letting Johnny scramble onto his back to reach the top of the tree was awkward and totally ridiculous. And once the star was finally in place, Johnny let out a triumphant cheer, while Amanda just shook her head. Carl smirked as he stood there, saying, "This might be the most undignified thing you've ever done." Johnny held on tight to his good shoulder, but they were nowhere near settled in yet. The three of them were sprawled out on the couch in front of the fireplace, and the room had this lovely smell of pine and cinnamon. The lights from the Christmas tree were casting a warm glow, and Amanda hadn't realized just how much she missed this kind of holiday. The kind of situation where nothing was over the top or meticulously arranged, where everything just happened organically, filled with a sense of calm. In those moments of unexpected warmth, Johnny, halfway through a cookie, began to nod. Amanda watched them, her gaze fixed on Carl's arm, something stirring deep inside her. Her chest felt tight. She really hadn't seen any of this coming, especially not the way Johnny had reacted to Carl so fast. Not the same Carl who used to laugh at the whole idea of family. Traditions just seemed to blend right into their little world, and definitely not the way she had begun to look forward to seeing him. Hearing his voice, and knowing he was just a text or phone call away, she exhaled slowly. "This is different for you, isn't it?" she said. Carl glanced at her softly, not really expecting an answer. What is Christmas? So, the whole family was there, and he didn't say anything at first. His good hand was just resting lightly against Johnny's back. Almost without thinking, when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd expected. "Have you ever heard someone say, 'I didn't think I wanted it'?" Amanda set her mug down, just watching. Carl looked at the fire, his expression hard to read. "I've spent years. I kept telling myself that I didn't really need this, that it was all just unnecessary and a distraction. I really convinced myself of that. I was better off without it." And he let out a breath that was almost like a laugh. "So, it turns out I was wrong." Amanda's fingers curled around the. He turned toward her, sitting on the edge of the couch, and it wasn't easy to admit that. There was something changing in his expression, but it wasn't the words that lingered between them. There was this unspoken meaning hanging in the air, and Amanda could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs as she swallowed. She had been really careful, feeling so certain that staying away was the best choice. Just sitting here, I can't help but notice how Carl's fingers gently curled around the fabric of Johnny's shirt while he sleeps. She noticed the way he looked at her, not with amusement or flirtation, but with something deeper, something real. She knew it. She quietly admitted that there was no more pretending. She was scared. But Carl didn't feel the same way. She turned her gaze away, exhaling slowly, allowing someone to come in again, and then, after losing them for a long time, he stayed silent for a bit. But then he spoke up with quiet certainty. He said, "I've never wanted anything more than this." Her heart skipped. She could have brushed it off, could have laughed, could have turned it into another one of their games, but she didn't. She didn't want to, so instead, she leaned in. Carl didn't move, not even a little. Breathe as she moved closer. The kiss was slow and careful, like neither of them wanted to disrupt what had been developing between them for so long. His fingers curled softly against her arm, pulling her just a little closer, deepening the moment just enough to make her pulse stutter, and then, "Took you." "Hey guys, that was long enough," Amanda said, pulling back just in time to catch Johnny cracking one eye open, his face half buried in Carl's. Carl let out a quiet groan about the sweater. Johnny grinned sleepily and said, "You should. You really need to listen to me more," Amanda sighed, pressing a hand over her face. "Just go to." Johnny yawned dramatically. "Fine, but this is officially the best." During Christmas, Carl glanced at Amanda, and there was something soft lingering in his gaze. "Yeah," he murmured, "it really is." Carl hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep. On the couch, the fire had settled into a gentle glow, and a blanket was draped over him at some point during the night. The stiffness in his shoulder reminded him that he had dozed off in a. He wouldn't suggest that position to anyone, especially not with a broken arm. But for once, he didn't move just yet. In a hurry, laughter bounced around from the kitchen as Johnny was chatting about something. Syrup and pancakes. And something about a snowman, his voice bubbling with energy that showed no signs of slowing down. For the holiday, Amanda responded with a soft hum, the sound of a spatula clinking following her words. Carl sat up slowly. He shifted the blanket off his lap, wincing a bit as he flexed his fingers. His body ached, but his mind was still active. He felt a calmness that he couldn't quite recall experiencing before. As he glanced around the room, he noticed the twinkling lights on the tree, still blinking lazily, and exhaled, letting the weight of the moment sink in. It was Christmas morning, and for the first time in years, he found himself not alone as he wandered into the kitchen. Following the aroma of butter, batter, and a hint of sweetness that could have been cinnamon filled the air as Amanda raised an eyebrow at his appearance. Her hair was pulled back, giving her a vibe that felt less like the guarded therapist he had first met and more like the woman he was getting to know, who had been gradually unraveling him for months. Said, "You're supposed to be resting." She said it softly. "I am," he replied, leaning against the counter. While I was resting, Johnny took a quick look over from the table where he was already settled in. You really have to try the pancakes and syrup. They're way better than hospital food, don't you think? So, Miles and Carl mentioned that they all sat down together just a few minutes later, the three of them. They all gathered around Amanda's cozy kitchen table, passing plates and pouring juice as if it were second nature to them. Carl didn't say much. He just watched, listened, and soaked it all in. It's all about finding comfort in the noise, in the quiet familiarity of those who have nothing to prove. Once breakfast wrapped up, Johnny was all about the presents. He pulled them both into the living room and tossed them around excitedly. He flopped onto the floor in front of the tree, dramatically pointing at the few wrapped boxes arranged underneath. Carl. Amanda glanced over, and I felt a bit uncertain. I really wasn't expecting to get involved in this part. You actually showed up, she said, handing him a mug of hot chocolate. That's all it takes. He leaned back on the couch, watching Johnny rip into a package like he was a much bigger guy. Wrapping paper went flying, tape got stuck in his hair, and he let out a triumphant cheer when he spotted a small remote. Amanda handed Carl a package wrapped in red and gold paper. It was smaller and flatter. This one's from me, she said, casually handing it over. He opened it slowly. Inside, there was a simple leather notebook, unlined, with a pin loop stitched into the spine. He ran his fingers over it. She covered it and opened the first page, where her handwriting greeted him, just in case. You ever feel like sharing your story? He asked, glancing at her. She was already focused on helping Johnny with his next task. She wasn't looking for a reaction. It felt like she was giving something meaningful while acting like it didn't matter. But before he could say anything, Johnny crawled over with a small box wrapped in snowflake paper. This one's from me. Carl accepted it with a smile. A nod? What's that? Is it a business proposal? Better yet, he opened the box and found There was a folded piece of white paper, thick with colored marker. It was a card. There was a drawing on the front that looked like a house, with 3 stick figures standing in front. One had curly hair, and one had a cast on his arm, and one with what he thought was a really stylish scarf above. It was written in bold crayon. Merry Christmas, Carl. Inside the message was, So, I told you my plan would work, right? Carl just laughed and shook his head at me. You really don't give up, do you? Johnny beamed. Nope, he replied, looking at Amanda again. She gave a little shrug, but there was a warmth in her eyes that she wasn't trying to hide anymore. Something had definitely shifted between them. He could really feel something real. I'm not sure what your hourly rate is, Carl said as he set the card down. But hey, your matchmaking skills could be worth a shot, right? Johnny puffed up proudly. Got it. We'll accept payment in pancakes and video games. I'll keep that in mind for the rest of the morning. It all went by quietly. No hurried meetings, no phone calls, and no urgent emails. Just Carl's. The phone just sat there on the entry table, and he didn't even think about checking it. Instead, he focused on helping to clean up the dishes even though Amanda wasn't really into it, and later when Johnny pushed for it, while showing off a Lego set he got from his grandparents. Carl hopped onto the rug and let himself be directed. So, by early afternoon, Johnny had dozed off again after figuring out the right spot for everything. Sprawled across the couch with the blanket pulled up to his chin, he was cozy and relaxed. Meanwhile, Amanda was in the kitchen making tea, but when she came back to find Carl still sitting on the rug, the half-built Lego set in front of him just sitting there, she plopped down next to him. She tucked her knees up during that long morning, and he just shook his head, saying it was the best one he'd had. Amanda smiled, and it had been a while since she felt that way. It was quiet, but Carl noticed he seemed happier here. Johnny looked over at her, and I felt the same way. They didn't kiss again. It just wasn't there. There didn't need to be a grand speech or some official moment of declaration, Carl. They weren't really thinking about next week or the next quarter, or if this thing between them had any strings attached. He couldn't help but think about how right it felt to be sitting in this house, wearing a sweater that wasn't even his, with a warm cup in hand. With chocolate in one hand and a handmade card in the other, he realized this was what it was like to just stop performing, to stop calculating, and to love someone freely, wanting it to have a specific look. And as the snow started to gently fall outside the window, it blanketed the street in that fresh layer of quiet. He realized something for sure. He never wanted to return to the life he once had. The year after Carl's first Christmas with Amanda and Johnny really changed him in ways he never saw coming. He was still a billionaire, still ruthless in board meetings, still the guy who had built an empire from nothing but sheer determination. Work didn't take over his life like it used to. The office lights didn't shine late into the night, and his inbox wasn't the first thing on his mind anymore. He checked in the morning. Business was still important, but it wasn't the same anymore. The only thing that really defined him was how he found himself thinking about school pickup schedules and weekend plans. There were movie nights and soccer games. And I kept wondering if Johnny had remembered to pack his lunch. He definitely spent more time at Amanda's house felt cozier than his penthouse, and whenever he wasn't there, he really missed the warmth of it and how it felt so lived in. Amanda was humming to herself in the kitchen, while Johnny was going on and on about his latest obsession. Grasp of his 7-year-old mind. It didn't all happen at once. It was a grand moment of realization, you know? It happened gradually, steadily, like something that just built over time. Time passed, and before he realized it, they had become more than just a part of his life. They were his entire life. So, as their anniversary was coming up, Carl thought it would be a great idea to do something really special for Johnny. Carl had been begging for a beach vacation for months, ever since he watched this documentary about sea turtles. He shrugged and said, "Fine." But the more he thought about it, the more it started to make sense, a trip for the three of them somewhere. It was warm, somewhere away from everything. Just perfect for what he had in mind. The Bahamas turned out to be the ideal spot. Just what they were looking for. Sunny days packed with relaxed mornings by the water, with Johnny happily splashing Carl. Whenever she had the opportunity, Amanda lounged in the sand, a smirk on her face as she observed Carl. He couldn't help but enjoy those evenings spent wandering through small shops. We were trying out seafood at these restaurants with amazing ocean views, and then we took some walks along the shore. Of course, Johnny ended up falling at some point. Carl was totally wiped out and fell asleep early. He had this big plan to propose on their second night. But then Johnny stumbled upon a group of kids was busy building sand castles, and Amanda seemed really relaxed as she curled up on a beach chair with her book. And Carl was thinking, what's the hurry? So, then the third night rolled around and so they went to the fourth, and now here they are on their final evening. With the sky all painted in those deep shades of violet and gold, Carl suddenly felt a wave of nervousness wash over him. I've dealt with boardroom battles, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and built an empire from scratch, but here I am, standing on this quiet stretch of beach had him feeling a bit more alive. His pulse was definitely picking up. Amanda must have sensed it too. She glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "You're acting weird," she said. Carl forced She smirked, tapping a finger against her chin like she was deep in thought. "You're feeling a bit fidgety, huh? You keep checking your pocket like you expect something to just drop out." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe I just like having pockets." Amanda narrowed her eyes. "Did Johnny tossed another crab into your shoes?" And Carl let out a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Not this time. She was still watching him with amusement. Her gaze flickered as she waited for him to say whatever it was that had him feeling so uncharacteristically unsettled. "Carl." He inhaled deeply, letting the sound of the waves calm him. Then, he reached into his pocket, and Amanda's smile faded a bit. She watched him pull out a small velvet box, and Carl didn't open it right away. He just held it in his palm. After turning it over once and then exhaling, "I realized you changed my life, Amanda. You and that." Amanda's breath caught, but she didn't say a word. "That little troublemaker of yours." Carl's voice was softer now, but there was a sense of certainty in it. "I used to believe that love wasn't something I was meant to experience, that some people just aren't built for it." He shook his head a bit. "But then I met you, and Johnny, and all the things I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted shifted." He flicked the box open, revealing a stunning ring, simple but elegant. It was something he had picked out with care. Johnny had some strong opinions a few weeks back. "So," he said, holding it out to her. With a rare softness in his expression, he asked, "What do you say? Marry me?" Amanda, just for a moment. She didn't move, then let out a slow breath and grinned. "Took you long enough." Just as Carl was about to say something, a blur of movement zipped in from behind the nearby tree. "Yes, Mom, say yes. I can't keep this." Johnny couldn't keep it a secret any longer. He burst out of his hiding spot, arms flailing in excitement, bouncing in place like he had I've been holding back so much energy for weeks. Just say yes. We had a whole plan. Amanda turned, half laughing, half exasperated. You knew Johnny scoffed at it. Of course, I knew I helped pick the ring, and I told him what to say, but I think he... Carl let out a breath of laughter, shaking his head. You wanted. Johnny insisted that I should include a joke about sea turtles. It would have been good. Amanda glanced between them, her eyes warm, then shifted her gaze back down to the ring in Carl's hand, her fingers curling around his. With a steady and sure motion, Carl slid the ring onto her finger and then pulled her in close. He kissed her slowly and with confidence while Johnny cheered dramatically in the background. Later, as they gathered around the bonfire, Johnny was in the midst of an excited retelling of the whole proposal from. Amanda leaned into Carl's perspective, including the parts he contributed, with her head resting against his shoulder. Carl glanced down at her and then, looking at the ring on her finger, he still couldn't quite wrap his head around how he had ended up here. It was hard to believe that the man who had spent years convinced he was better off alone had somehow turned into someone who spent his evenings cozy and surrounded by love and he had this family that had formed around him without him even noticing. But he wasn't going to question it. He was just going with the flow. Holding on, the wedding was everything Amanda had dreamed of, intimate, warm, and just perfect. Surrounded by the people who meant the most, a lakeside villa bathed in soft golden light. The trees were lined up, and you could hear the gentle ripple of water in the background while the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over everything. The glow felt almost unreal. Johnny had really insisted on being the ring bearer, a role. He really took it seriously. When the moment arrived, he walked down the aisle at a painfully slow pace, his chin up. He carried the ring pillow like royalty, making sure everyone admired it. Guests laughed, but Amanda and Carl just shared a knowing glance. He had been looking forward to this moment for what felt like forever. It was her turn, and Carl, who usually kept it together, found himself a bit off balance. He gripped the edge of his cuff to steady himself, having spent years perfecting the art of control. His feelings tucked away so they wouldn't mess with reason or work or the carefully built. The life he had built, but as he stood there watching Amanda walk toward him in that dress, his heart was racing. He felt completely undone by her ribs. She was stunning, radiant in a way that made everything else faded into the background. He could barely hear the music or register anything except for the way she looked at him as if she had always known he would end up here, like this was exactly where he was meant to be. Belonged, and then suddenly, nothing from his past seemed to matter when she finally reached him. She let out a slow breath, her eyes flickering over his face as if she were committing this moment to memory. The officiant nearby spoke, but Carl hardly took in what was being said. It wasn't until Amanda's fingers. He tightened his grip slightly as he realized it was time for the vows. Her voice trembled just a little as she spoke. I never thought I'd end up falling for Carl Stevenson, but somehow, here we are. You found your way into both my heart and Johnny's, and honestly, I can't picture life without you now. Carl swallowed, trying to steady himself. He had spent weeks thinking about what to say, drafting and discarding words. It didn't seem like enough, but now, as I stand in front of her, the only thing that feels right is the truth. I always thought I'd be the kind of guy who deserved this, but you inspire me to be better every single day. I love you. Amanda and I really love Johnny. You're like family to me, and I promise I won't ever take that for granted. She took that for granted, her eyes shimmering as her fingers tightened around his when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Carl hardly waited for permission before pulling her in and capturing her mouth with his, tuning out the cheers around them. As the sun set and the celebration continued, Johnny let out this over-the-top gagging noise that really caught everyone's attention. Under the twinkling lights, Carl and Amanda swayed together on the dance floor, surrounded by the laughter of friends. Family was drifting around them, and Carl leaned in, murmuring, I never. Make sure to thank Johnny properly for bringing us together. Amanda smirked against his shoulder. He's already making a list of, things you owe him, Carl sighed. Of course he is. Before Amanda could, Johnny is still in his little tuxedo, which is now a bit wrinkled after a whole evening of running around, wrapped his arms around both their waists in a bit of a clumsy hug and said, Best day ever. Carl let out a chuckle, resting his hand on Johnny's head. Yeah, it really was. Months later, Amanda and Carl found themselves in a It was a familiar setting, like a therapist's office, but this time, the couch was missing. Amanda's clinic and the session weren't mandatory, Dr. Garcia, for their new couples. The therapist raised an eyebrow, looking back and forth between them. So, what brings you two in today? Carl leaned back with a smirk. Honestly, we just thought it'd be fun to check out what therapy feels like when I'm not venting about my ex-wife. Amanda rolled her eyes, but couldn't help but laugh. He was really persistent. He mentions that it's our full circle moment, and Dr. Garcia blinked, looking a bit unsure if they were on the same page. We were just joking around, so no big deal to work through. Carl shrugged and said, "Oh, plenty, but we figured it out. We'd get ahead of them this time." He turned to Amanda with a slow smile. "Besides, I really enjoy talking about my feelings." Now Amanda snorted, "That's debatable." Just then, the door burst open, and Johnny leaned in. "Are you guys done yet? We have movie night at Dr. Garcia's place." Opened slightly. Who is Johnny?" Grinned. "I'm the reason they're married." Amanda sighed as she got up. "Okay, that's enough matchmaker credit for one day." As they walked away, Carl casually draped an arm around Amanda and leaned in to give her a kiss. "Temple, well, that was a blast. Let's plan to do it again in a year." Amanda just shook her head, but she just couldn't help but smile, even when everything seemed to be against her. Carl Stevenson went from being her toughest patient to the love of her life, and that was just the best thing ever. If you like this story, make sure to remember it. If you could leave a like, it would really help the channel out. And if you're into more heartwarming and emotional stories like this one, just let me know. Hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any uploads. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to know what you think about this one. Thanks for tuning in, and I can't wait to catch you in the next story.